The sun was setting over the manicured lawns of Serenity Oaks, a gated community nestled in the hills of Orange County, California. The neighborhood was a postcard of suburban perfection. Pristine white picket fences, identical Mediterranean-style villas with terracotta roofs, and streets so quiet you could hear the hum of a Tesla gliding by. It was the kind of place where residents paid premium HOA fees to ensure their lives remained as frictionless as their polished marble countertops. But there was one thorn in Serenity Oaks' meticulously curated side: Jonathan Jack Ryder. Jack was a man who refused to blend in. At 45, he had the weathered charm of someone who'd spent more time on the open road than in boardrooms. His salt and pepper beard and leather jacket stood out like a rebellion against the community's pastel polo shirts and golf carts. Yet what truly set him apart was his prized possession: a 1972 Harley-Davidson FLH Black Viper, a snarling beast of chrome and matte black steel. The bike wasn't just a machine, it was a relic. Jack's late father, a Vietnam War veteran, had rebuilt it from scrap during long nights in their garage, bonding with his son over grease-stained manuals and the roar of its engine. When his father passed, the bike became Jack's inheritance, a rolling memorial he vowed never to part with. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning. Jack was sipping coffee on his porch when a crisp white envelope appeared in his mailbox. Inside was a notice from the Serenity Oaks Homeowners Association, signed by its president, Margaret Holloway. "Dear Mr. Ryder," it read, "multiple residents have complained about your motorcycle's excessive noise and eyesore appearance. Per HOA bylaws section 12.3, all vehicles must adhere to community aesthetic standards. Please remove the motorcycle from your driveway within 72 hours or face fines." Jack snorted. He'd known moving here was a gamble, but after his divorce, he'd wanted a fresh start, somewhere quiet to rebuild. He'd assumed the HOA's rules were about keeping lawns trimmed, not policing his garage. Still, he'd tried to compromise. He parked the Black Viper in his driveway under a custom tarp, its engine silent unless he was riding. Yet the complaints kept coming. Margaret Holloway was a woman who wore her HOA pin like a military medal. At 62, she ruled Serenity Oaks with a clipboard and a vendetta against anything that disrupted her vision of suburban utopia. Her daily patrols in a golf cart were legendary. She'd once fined a family for leaving a Halloween skeleton on their lawn 2 days after November 1st. When Jack first moved in, Margaret had welcomed him with a binder of HOA rules thicker than a phone book. "We pride ourselves on harmony," she'd said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. But harmony, Jack soon learned, meant conformity. The Black Viper wasn't just loud. It had a personality. Its engine growled like a caged panther, a sound that made car alarms wail and small dogs yap. Jack only rode it on weekends, sticking to back roads to avoid irritating neighbors. But in Serenity Oaks, even a single rev was enough to draw glares. "It's a safety hazard," argued Mrs. Thompson, a retiree who lived 3 houses down. "My poodle, Mr. Snuffles, has anxiety. Maybe buy him noise-canceling headphones," Jack quipped. The HOA didn't laugh. At night, Jack would tinker with the Viper in his garage, the smell of motor oil and old vinyl records filling the air. The bike was a time capsule. Its leather seat still bore his father's initials, carved clumsily with a pocket knife. Every scratch told a story: cross-country road trips, breakdowns in the desert, the time they'd outrun a thunderstorm in Nevada. His ex-wife, Linda, had never understood his attachment. "It's just a bike," she'd say, rolling her eyes as he spent weekends polishing its fuel tank. But to Jack, it was the last thread connecting him to the man who'd taught him about grit and freedom. 2 weeks after the first notice, Margaret appeared at Jack's doorstep. Her lavender blouse clashed with her frosty demeanor. "Mr. Ryder," she began, "this is your final warning. The motorcycle must go." Jack crossed his arms. "It's on private property. I'm not breaking any laws. HOA bylaws are the law here," she snapped. "And that contraption violates section 12.3. No vehicle may detract from the community's visual or auditory harmony." Jack smirked. "Harmony, huh? Maybe you should hear my neighbor's kid practice the recorder." Margaret's lips tightened. You have 48 hours. After that, we'll take appropriate action. The next day, Jack arrived home to find a neon orange sticker plastered on the Viper's tarp. Condemned, HOA violation. His blood boiled. He stormed to the HOA office, a sleek building with a fountain out front that cost more than his first car. Margaret sat behind her desk, flanked by 2 board members. "We're authorized to remove any property deemed a nuisance," she said coolly. "Consider this a courtesy notice." Jack leaned forward, his voice low. "Touch that bike, and I'll sue this HOA into oblivion." Margaret didn't flinch. "We'll see you in court, Mr. Ryder." For a week, nothing happened. Jack hired a lawyer, a bulldog named Carl who specialized in property rights. "HOAs hate bad publicity," Carl said. "We'll send a cease and desist. They'll back down." But Serenity Oaks wasn't backing down. Unbeknownst to Jack, Margaret had called an emergency board meeting. A vote passed unanimously. The Black Viper would be removed as a public nuisance. They waited until Jack was gone. Jack's phone buzzed during a layover in Chicago. A text from his assistant. "Meeting moved up. Client wants the pitch tomorrow." He groaned. As CEO of Ryder Motors, a boutique automotive design firm, his schedule was chaos. What Margaret didn't know, what no one in Serenity Oaks knew, was that Ryder Motors wasn't just any firm. 3 months prior, Harley-Davidson had quietly acquired it, and Jack was now their incoming CEO. The announcement was set for the following month. He texted back, "Book the next flight, and remind legal to finalize the Harley merger docs." As his plane took off, a tow truck rolled into Serenity Oaks. The fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 buzzed like angry hornets as Jack Ryder paced near Gate B12. His phone pressed to his ear. On the other end, his lawyer Carl's voice crackled with static. "They're bluffing, Jack. HOAs love to throw their weight around. But seizing private property? That's a lawsuit even they can't afford." Jack glanced at his watch. 9:47 p.m. His flight to Milwaukee for the Harley-Davidson merger meeting had been delayed, and the knot in his stomach tightened. "Just keep an eye on the house, Carl. If they so much as touch that tarp, relax. I've already filed the injunction. They'd have to be suicidal to move forward now." But Carl didn't know Margaret Holloway. Back in Serenity Oaks, the moon hung low, casting long shadows over the sleeping neighborhood. A tow truck idled at the community's entrance, its yellow hazard lights blinking rhythmically like a predator's eyes. Inside the cab, 2 men in stained coveralls squinted at a work order. "Says here it's a public nuisance vehicle," the driver muttered, scratching his stubble. "Some kind of motorcycle." His partner, a teenager named Danny, frowned. "You sure this is legal? The address is a private home. HOA signed off on it. They're the law in these parts." The truck rolled silently down Cypress Lane, stopping at Jack's driveway. Danny hopped out, flashlight in hand. The Black Viper sat shrouded under its tarp, its silhouette proud even in the dark. As he yanked off the cover, the bike gleamed faintly, its chrome reflecting slivers of moonlight. "Damn," Danny whistled. "This thing's a classic. Why's the HOA want it gone?" "Rich people problems," the driver grunted, attaching chains to the Viper's frame. "Help me load it." The engine roared to life, shattering the neighborhood's silence. A few porch lights flickered on. Mrs. Thompson peered through her curtains, clutching Mr. Snuffles. Down the street, old Mr. Peterson stepped outside in his bathrobe, ready to shout until he saw the HOA logo on the tow truck. He retreated inside. By dawn, the Black Viper was gone. In Milwaukee, Jack sat in a sleek conference room overlooking Lake Michigan, his mind only half present. The Harley-Davidson board members droned on about brand synergy and legacy innovation, unaware that their new CEO was mentally replaying Carl's voicemail. "Jack, call me ASAP. It's about the bike." He excused himself, slipping into the hallway. Carl picked up on the first ring. "They took it." Jack's knuckles whitened around the phone. "What?" "The HOA. They hired a liquidation company. The Viper's already been auctioned." The world tilted. Jack leaned against the wall, his father's voice echoing in his head. "Never let him see you rattled, son. Where is it now?" he asked, eerily calm. "Some collector in Nevada bought it for $15,000. "Jack, I'm sorry. We'll sue, but, 15,000. That bike's insured for $2 million. It's one of 3 prototypes for Harley's 120th anniversary line. They haven't even announced it yet." Carl went silent. "You're kidding. Get the buyer's info. Offer triple what he paid. I don't care if it's $50,000. Just get it back." "And the HOA?" Jack's voice dropped to a whisper. "Burn them to the ground." Margaret Holloway sipped chamomile tea at her kitchen island, savoring the morning's quiet victory. The HOA board had gathered at dawn to celebrate, nibbling on gluten-free scones. "A unanimous decision," chirped Vice President Greg Barnes, adjusting his bow tie. "A bold move, Margaret, but necessary." "Indeed," she said, brushing crumbs off the HOA's latest newsletter. The front page boasted, "Community integrity restored," with a photo of Jack's empty driveway. She'd taken it herself. Her phone rang. A known number. "Margaret Holloway," she answered crisply. "You have 24 hours to return my property." She recognized the voice, smug, rough around the edges. "Ryder, I'm afraid that's impossible, Mr. Ryder. The motorcycle was sold legally per HOA bylaws." "Legally?" Jack chuckled, a sound with no humor. "You stole a vintage Harley, Margaret. Do you know what happens when you piss off Harley-Davidson?" She rolled her eyes. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you. That motorcycle is part of a federally protected intellectual property portfolio. By selling it, you've breached international trademark laws." "Oh, and the buyer? He's already been contacted by my legal team. Turns out he's very eager to avoid a lawsuit." Margaret's teacup clattered against its saucer. "You're bluffing. Check your email." Her laptop pinged. A message from Carl's law firm, Ryder and Associates, with a scanned letter from Harley-Davidson's general counsel. Words jumped out. "Criminal charges? Grand theft. $5 million in damages." The room swayed. Greg Barnes leaned over her shoulder, paling. "Margaret, what is this?" Jack's voice hardened. "You're going to retract the sale, publicly apologize, and pray I don't take your house." The line went dead. Danny stared at the $50,000 check in his hand, then at the black Viper chained to his boss's flatbed. The buyer from Nevada had called an hour ago, screaming about lawyers. Now this guy in a suit, Carl, was handing him a briefcase of cash. "Keep the check as a bonus," Carl said. "Just sign here." Danny scribbled his name, still dazed. As the truck pulled away, he texted his girlfriend, "You won't believe the day I've had." Jack stood in his driveway at midnight, the Viper back in its rightful place. He ran a hand over its fuel tank, still warm from the 2,000-mile ride home. The garage door creaked open, revealing walls plastered with blueprints and patents, designs for Harley's next-generation bikes. A half-finished sketch lay on his workbench, a cruiser with the Viper's iconic curves. His phone lit up with a Milwaukee area code. The board. "Mr. Ryder," the chairman said, "we've seen the news, this HOA situation. It's unfortunate timing. Perhaps we should delay the CEO announcement." Jack smiled. "Delay it? I want it moved up. Tomorrow." "But the scandal." "There is no scandal. Only free publicity." He hung up, revved the Viper's engine once, and listened as its growl rattled Serenity Oaks' windows. Somewhere down the street, a car alarm wailed. The morning sun rose over Serenity Oaks, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns and pristine driveways. But the tranquility was shattered by the sound of engines, dozens of them. A convoy of motorcycles rumbled through the gates, their riders clad in black leather and denim. At the front was Jack Ryder, astride the black Viper, its engine growling like a predator unleashed. Residents spilled onto their porches, clutching coffee mugs and cell phones. Mrs. Thompson dropped her teacup, shattering it on the cobblestones. Mr. Peterson fumbled with his hearing aid, convinced he was hallucinating. And Margaret Holloway stood frozen in her driveway, her lavender blouse wrinkled, her clipboard trembling in her hands. Jack pulled up to the HOA office, the Viper's tires crunching on the gravel. He dismounted, removing his helmet to reveal a face etched with quiet fury. Behind him, the riders formed a semicircle, their bikes idling like a pack of wolves. "Margaret," Jack said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a storm. "We need to talk." By 9 a.m., news vans lined the streets of Serenity Oaks. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras trained on the HOA office. The story had broken overnight. Harley-Davidson CEO's vintage bike illegally sold by HOA. Social media exploded with hashtags like #Vipergate and #HOAGoneWild. Margaret sat inside the office, flanked by the HOA board. Greg Barnes mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "This is a PR nightmare," he whispered. "We followed the bylaws," Margaret insisted, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "He's bluffing." The door swung open, and Jack strode in, flanked by Carl and a team of lawyers. He dropped a stack of papers on the table. "Cease and desist order," Carl said. "Federal trademark violation, grand theft, emotional distress, and that's just the first page." Margaret's hands shook as she flipped through the documents. This is outrageous." Jack leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You stole my father's legacy. You sold it for pennies, and now you're going to answer for it." At noon, Jack stood on the steps of the HOA office, the black Viper gleaming beside him. Microphones crowded the podium, and cameras flashed like lightning. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "My name is Jonathan Ryder, and as of today, I am the CEO of Harley-Davidson." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face turned ashen. "This bike," Jack continued, resting a hand on the Viper's fuel tank, "is more than a machine. It's a symbol of freedom, of rebellion, of the open road. And it's a reminder that no one, not even an HOA, can take away what matters most to us." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The Serenity Oaks HOA illegally seized and sold my property, violating not only my rights but the trust of this community. Today, I'm announcing a lawsuit to hold them accountable. But more importantly, I'm announcing a new initiative, the Harley-Davidson Freedom Fund, dedicated to fighting overreach by HOAs and protecting the rights of homeowners." The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters shouted questions, but Jack raised a hand, silencing them. "One last thing," he said, turning to Margaret, who stood in the doorway, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "You wanted harmony, Margaret. Well, here it is." He revved the Viper's engine, its roar echoing through the neighborhood. Then he mounted the bike and rode off, the convoy of riders following in his wake. By evening, Serenity Oaks was in chaos. Residents gathered in the community center, demanding answers. Margaret and the board faced a barrage of accusations, their authority crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. "You've ruined us," shouted Mrs. Thompson, clutching a trembling Mr. Snuffles. "Do you know how much our property values are going to drop?" Greg Barnes tried to calm the crowd, but his words were drowned out by jeers. "We followed the bylaws," he pleaded. "The bylaws are garbage," someone yelled. Meanwhile, Jack's announcement went viral. Memes flooded the internet. Margaret's face photoshopped onto a motorcycle cop, the Viper roaring through a field of HOA rulebooks. The hashtag ViperJustice trended worldwide. Jack sat in his garage that night, a bottle of bourbon in one hand and a wrench in the other. The Viper sat before him, its engine purring contentedly. He raised a toast to his father's memory, then got to work on a new design, a limited edition Harley inspired by the Viper, with proceeds going to the Freedom Fund. His phone buzzed with a text from Carl. HOA's lawyer called. "They want to settle." Jack smirked. "Tell them I'll see them in court." The Orange County Courthouse was a fortress of marble and glass, its halls echoing with the footsteps of lawyers, plaintiffs, and defendants. On a crisp Monday morning, the case of Ryder versus Serenity Oaks HOA drew a crowd that spilled out onto the steps. News vans lined the street, their satellite antennas pointed skyward like spears. Inside courtroom 4B, Jack Ryder sat at the plaintiff's table, his leather jacket replaced by a tailored suit. Across the aisle, Margaret Holloway and the HOA board fidgeted in their seats, their lawyer, a nervous man named Richard Graves, flipping through a stack of notes. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Alvarez, entered the room, her black robe billowing behind her. "This is a civil case," she began, her voice sharp as a blade. "But given the media attention, I expect decorum from both sides. Mr. Ryder, you may proceed." Jack's lawyer, Carl, stood, his confidence radiating like a lighthouse beam. "Your Honor, this case is about more than a motorcycle. It's about the abuse of power by the Serenity Oaks HOA, which illegally seized and sold my client's property, a one-of-a-kind Harley-Davidson prototype valued at $2 million. This wasn't just a violation of property rights. It was an attack on my client's personal legacy." He turned to the jury, a diverse group of 12 citizens who looked equal parts intrigued and overwhelmed. The HOA claims they acted within their bylaws. But bylaws don't supersede state and federal law. What they did was theft, plain and simple. Richard Graves rose, his tie slightly askew. "Your Honor, members of the jury, the HOA acted in the best interest of the community. Mr. Ryder's motorcycle was a nuisance, loud, disruptive, and unsightly. The bylaws clearly state that any vehicle deemed a public nuisance can be removed." Carl snorted. "A nuisance? Your Honor, the Black Viper was parked on private property, under a tarp, and was only ridden on weekends. If that's a nuisance, then half the cars in this county should be impounded." The jury chuckled. Judge Alvarez silenced them with a glare. Graves pressed on. The HOA followed proper procedures. Mr. Ryder was given multiple warnings. He chose to ignore them. "Proper procedures?" Carl shot back. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit A into evidence." A screen lit up, displaying a video of the midnight raid. The footage, captured by a neighbor's security camera, showed the tow truck hauling away the Viper. Carl paused the video, zooming in on the HOA logo on the truck's door. "This," Carl said, "isn't procedure, it's a heist." Jack took the stand, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Carl guided him through his testimony, painting a picture of the Viper's history and its emotional significance. "This bike," Jack said, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "was my father's masterpiece. He built it from scratch, taught me how to ride it, and left it to me when he passed. It's not just a motorcycle. It's a piece of my family's history." Graves rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Ryder, isn't it true that you deliberately flouted HOA rules to provoke a reaction?" Jack leaned into the microphone. "I didn't provoke anything. I just wanted to live my life without being micromanaged by a group of people who think they own the neighborhood." The jury exchanged glances. Graves pressed on. "And isn't it true that you're using your position as CEO of Harley-Davidson to intimidate the HOA?" Carl objected. "Argumentative, Your Honor." "Sustained," Judge Alvarez said, shooting Graves a warning look. After 2 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The courtroom was packed when they returned, the air thick with anticipation. "We, the jury," the foreperson began, "find in favor of the plaintiff, Jonathan Ryder, and award damages in the amount of $5 million. The room erupted. Margaret slumped in her seat, her clipboard slipping from her hands. Greg Barnes buried his face in his hands. Jack remained stoic, but a small smile played on his lips. Judge Alvarez banged her gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" She turned to the HOA's table. "This case should serve as a lesson. Homeowners associations exist to serve their communities, not to bully them. I hope you've learned that." The verdict made headlines worldwide. Harley-Davidson CEO wins $5 million in HOA lawsuit. Read one. Serenity Oaks HOA crushed by Black Viper, declared another. Margaret Holloway resigned as HOA president, her reputation in tatters. The remaining board members scrambled to revise the bylaws, but the damage was done. Property values in Serenity Oaks plummeted, and for sale signs sprouted like weeds. Jack, meanwhile, became a folk hero. The limited edition Viper-inspired Harley sold out within hours, raising millions for the Freedom Fund. He donated a portion of his settlement to the fund, ensuring that other homeowners would have the resources to fight back against overreaching HOAs. On a crisp autumn morning, Jack stood in his driveway, the black Viper gleaming in the sunlight. He strapped on his helmet, revved the engine, and roared out of Serenity Oaks for the last time. The wind whipped past him, carrying the scent of freedom. As he hit the open road, he thought of his father, of the lessons he'd learned, and of the legacy he'd protect. The Viper's engine growled, a sound that no longer echoed with defiance but with triumph. Somewhere behind him, Serenity Oaks faded into the distance, a cautionary tale of what happens when you underestimate a man and his machine.